Greetings and welcome to Mr. Campbell's Global 9 class. We're in Unit 5, The Age of Sail, Section B, The Conquest of the New World and the Triangle Trade, 1500s to 1700. Now, self-test questions. Describe the culture of the Aztec Empire. What were their achievements and how did they fall? 2. Describe the culture of the Inca Empire. What were their achievements and how did they fall? 3. Describe the reasons for the successful Spanish conquest of the New World. What was the encomienda system, and how did it affect Amerindians? And 4. What was the Triangle Trade? How did it impact African history and the history of the New World? So, starting out with Mesoamerican civilizations, which we haven't talked about since way, way, way early on in Unit 1. The Americas, both North and South, but we're going to be basically focusing on Central and South America for this set of notes. We're home to several major Mesoamerican civilizations, the Mayans, which we covered in Unit 1, the Aztec Empire, and the Inca Empire, both of which were destroyed by Spanish colonization and Spanish conquerors. Each of these groups of peoples had established their own powerful, large, urban centered civilizations through intensive agriculture of corn or maize, which was their staple crop. We've talked about this concept that all of civilization needs some sort of staple crop to provide the high caloric intake, the food surpluses that allow then specialization of labor, that allow then the development of true civilization versus culture. All of these civilizations had polytheistic religions with some level of human sacrifice, believing that their gods required to be sated or fed really with blood of individuals to keep the rains, to keep the sunlight, to keep the crops coming. The Mayan civilization disappeared between 800 and 900 CE, which will leave our discussion today over the last two, the Aztec and Inca empires. So the Aztec Empire, which lasted roughly from the 1200s to 1500 CE. The Aztec were a warrior group that built a massive capital at the lake of Tenochtitlan near Lake Texcoco in modern-day Mexico, and that's their kind of territorial holdings across Mexico. They increasingly began to conquer neighboring villages and other groups of towns and peoples to build what would eventually become an empire, right? An empire is when you conquer people and dictate kind of their fate politically, economically, and socially. The Aztec Empire demanded tribute from the conquered peoples in both goods, trade goods, and material, as well as actual people, which were then enslaved and used by the Aztecs for both labor and sacrifice. The Aztecs had built up their empire at the height of their power to be truly massive, controlling nearly 30 million people, and they maintained their rule over this empire through raids, kind of keeping the local villages in line, and through fear. They had very fearsome warrior cults, often based on animals, the eagle cult, the jaguar cult. They wore very specific traditional style clothing and armors. Each of these cults had specific weapons, and they were terrifying. They were very well armed, very skilled warriors for this area of the world, for their level of technology. The Aztec Empire had a social hierarchy with a king at the top and priestly class that would guide the king and interpret the signs of the gods and kind of oversee rituals, oversee religious elements of society. The religion was heavily polytheistic, sun gods, wind gods, rain gods, all that sort of stuff, and included blood sacrifice, the removal of the heart and generally the beheading of the sacrificed individual in order to appease the gods and ensure good crops coming in. The Aztecs were also a slaving empire, which made their rule resented by many of their subjects, which will impact the capability of the Spanish to destroy this empire. And these are time period primary source depictions of Aztec slavery. They basically use these collars as both the symbol of slavery to show that this person is a slave, and they can also control people by them as well. You can see they have a handle on them. It's very hard to take off by yourself, so it's hard to escape as a slave, as it were. It's not really racially based slavery. The Aztecs, the true blood Aztecs, did consider themselves superior to all others in their tribal empire. But they were not necessarily different colored skins or really a different race, just different tribal groups. Achievements of the Aztec empires include the construction of massive city complexes, huge, huge cities, especially their main one, Tenochtitlan, which was an utterly famous and amazing city. Each city had temples dedicated to the gods to keep them appeased. Each of these cities had massive markets where goods from across the empire would be traded and exchanged. And even the Spanish, when visiting, who, as Europeans were ethnocentric, they felt that they were racially and civilization wise superior to the Aztecs. Even the Spanish marveled at the size of Aztec cities, the size of their marketplaces, the sheer volume and wealth of goods being traded. The Spanish were pretty blown away by that. The Aztecs intensely cultivated and farmed corn, squash, and beans to feed this large population. And the Aztecs developed an accurate calendar to predict growing seasons. One of the most fascinating achievements and adaptations of the Aztec were the Chinapas. So the original land of like the actual Aztec people, where they kind of grew from a culture to a true civilization, was swampy. It was the swampy land surrounding the lake that we today call Texcoco. And as you know, like you can't really grow crops easily on a swamp. Plants do need water, but unless it's rice, too much water kills plants. It floods them. Just like any organism. And so they're unable to feed or house their large population unless they adapt to this. So they created these things called chinapas. And I'd like you to star that, please. Or as the Europeans kind of called them, floating gardens. So they didn't actually float, they were pieces of land, but it appeared as though they were floating. What they were a form of what we call land reclamation. You're making man made islands using wicker, mud, and plant roots to then eventually farm on. And you're able to use then the good soil of a swamp because the soil of swamp is generally quite fertile and full of nutrients. And after several seasons, as the Chinapa became firmer and firmer and firmer, and basically more solidified by the roots of several generations of plants growing on them, the Aztecs were then able to actually build on them. And so that's how they eventually expanded their cities as well, especially their capital city. And then they could use canals and the narrow waterway pathways to get through these. And these are very, very labor intensive to build, hence the massive slave population that the Aztecs. So these are different pictures of them, and again, labor intensive but effective, allowing the capital to eventually encompass 200,000 people, which is a massive size for a city of this time. It shows human interaction with and adaptation to geography. Chinampas are also an example of technology and innovation. So there's an artist's rendition of what Tenochtitlan looked like, and you can see it's literally a city growing out of a lake. And you can see here workers building these. So this is what you did. You took wood and you shaved it down into like pilings. Think of it like fence posts. You drove those down, creating a square, a box. And then you had workers stand in the swamp and they had to dig and pour the soil into the middle here, raising it above till it filled your box made out of pilings. Then you planted trees that would have very tough, strong roots along the outside, and you planted your crops, whether it's corn, whether it's beans and squash in the middle. And so then you could easily get around as a farmer and tend to your plants using wood dugout canoes, both harvesting the crops, etc. You could fish in the canals. The waterfowl would be there for you to hunt and keep as well. So really fascinating. And then after several years of planting on your chinapas with the roots getting more and more solid and holding the soil more firmly in it, and then the soil slowly decreasing in value, you could build buildings on the chinapa and then build new chinapas and farm. And so you're always going through this cycle of farming, building new chinapas, building buildings on the old chinapas, building new chinapas, farming, etc., etc. So what happens to the Aztecs? It seems like they've got it all going on. Granted they're a slave empire, but they're powerful for their area. They are relatively technologically advanced. Well, what happens is they are attacked. So in this age of discovery, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the English, the French, and to a lesser extent the Dutch had discovered, quote unquote, the New World. And the Aztec Empire became a target specifically of the Spanish Empire. They were conquered by Spanish conquistadors, which were basically not quite mercenaries, but they're like soldiers. A lot of them were taken from like the lesser nobility or middle class as they existed in Spanish who wanted better economic opportunities. And they came to the Americas seeking, the famous gold, glory, and gold. And there was some gold in the Aztec Empire and some silver as well. And they see, these nobles of the Aztecs with gold piercings and some gold jewelry. And they're like, yep, we want that. Show us where you're getting this. We're taking it all. And then, of course, the glory of winning these battles, claiming more land in the name of the Spanish crown. One of the main individuals responsible for the destruction of the Aztecs was the conquistador Hernan Cortez. So he lands in Mexico in 1519. And he doesn't actually have true permission to like invade the Aztec Empire. And so he burned his boats down in front of his soldiers. He's like, yep, the only way we're getting out of this new land is to conquer or die. There is no retreat. We have no ships to fall back to. We must win. And with only a couple hundred Spanish soldiers, he begins to move in on Aztec land. Now, they don't start at the capital, they start at the outskirts of this empire, and they find, well, they basically capture a young girl and other individuals, force them to learn Spanish, and use them as translators. And then they find that, well, a lot of the tribes in the outskirts of the empire resent harsh Aztec rule, resent the raids, resent the slavery, resent the high taxes and tribute. And so they begin to build an army of natives by making alliances with these tribes. In addition to building these alliances, which eventually bolstered the Spanish number by thousands of native soldiers, the Aztecs themselves were severely weakened by diseases. He's invading in 1522, but Europeans had been in the New World now for nearly 30 years. And that allowed the spread of these diseases, European diseases and Old World diseases, smallpox, measles, for, well, several, nearly 2 generations. And these diseases, again, as part of the Columbian Exchange, the natives had no resistances to these. And so huge numbers of Aztecs had been dying because of these diseases. One of the other crucial factors in this conquest was the superior weapons and tactics of the Spanish. You can see here, these are depictions of what Spanish conquistadors are armed with. They have steel or iron armor. They have steel spears, steel swords, steel breastplates. They also had guns, both handguns, muskets, matchlocks, as well as some cannons too. They also brought horses with them, which had never been seen in the New World, so are a terrifying new weapon of fear. And are going to have a relatively big impact on this war, though there aren't a lot of these horses. And so by 1521, the Aztec emperor had been killed and the Aztec empire conquered. So in only a handful of years, Cortez is able to conquer effectively this massive. So let's dig a little bit deeper into why the Spanish technology played such a huge part in this. Superior weapons, superior tactics helped defeat the Aztec and Inca empires. What are they? Gunpowder. I mean, the natives, the Amerindians, had never seen anything like cannons and matchlocks. And to them, it seemed like literally the power of the gods, right? Some guy points a stick at you, and you're like, all right, well, maybe it's a blowgun. I don't know what this thing's going to do. And suddenly a foot gout of flame and thunderous booms issue from this thing. And your soldier you've been training with, your whole life next to you's head explodes or torso caves in because of the impact of these 50 caliber lead shots. Really terrifying weapon when you've never fought against this stuff. The Spanish also used steel weapons and armor, steel swords, steel shields, steel breastplates, steel helmets, and that is wildly more effective. So the main weapons used by the Aztecs and other natives were stone, wood, and they also had access to obsidian. Obsidian is a volcanic rock that can be sharpened. You can chip it to make incredibly sharp weapons. But at the end of the day, it is a rock. And when you try to hit this on the steel breastplate of a Spanish soldier or steel shield, like these weapons shatter. Or if a Spanish soldier counters your attack with his steel sword, it shatters or can cut through a wooden weapon. The steel armor protects Spanish soldiers. Horses, which had never been seen by the native Aztec and Incas, are terrifying and could be used powerfully to, skirt or flank around enemy positions and rout them. And so, really, really crazy weapon disadvantage here, where the innovations and technologies of European weapons, brought to them by the Muslims and through the Chinese long-term cultural diffusion, give them a decisive edge against the Aztecs and Incas. Another element of it dealt a little bit with tactics. So we must remind ourselves that the Aztecs and the Incas were both slaving empires, and their weapons are very effective against other people that have their level of technology. But a lot of times, the Aztecs and Incas didn't necessarily want to kill people in their fighting. They would raid other villages, they would raid other communities to get slaves, both to do the labor of the Chinampas and agricultural labor, and for sacrifices to the gods. The Spanish, on the other hand, are coming from the European theater of war, where you are fighting to kill and destroy your enemy, to destroy their bases, to take over. That's what European warfare was. No one really cared about capturing people unless capturing like an entire army meant you beat that army. But Europeans fought to kill people. And so this is a drastic playoff where maybe the weapons, tactics, and fighting styles of the natives are just not suited to this more fearsome style of European warfare and the terrifying nature of it. Now we're going to look at the Inca Empire, which lasted from 1438 until 1533 CE. The Incas are organized in actual South America along the western coastline, and they built a highly centralized, powerful political state. They were also led by an emperor like the Aztecs, who also acted as a religious leader, effectively kind of like the head priest of their civilization. They, like the Aztecs, conquered other tribes and groups over the space of 100 or so years. They too forced other tribes to give them tribute, both in goods and labor. While they were slavers, they more typically used corvée labor, or every village had to give them a certain number of workers to labor a certain number of weeks or months each year. And we've seen labor for tribute as a form that was used in some other empires before. Conquered groups were then forced or expected to adopt the Inca religion and Incan language, so they're kind of enforcing their style of rule. You can see here some depictions of Inca soldiers. What the weapons they used are, again, stone or low level metal axes, throwing spears with an azatal, which basically allows you to increase the force, wooden shields, or sometimes types of wicker shields, a lot of clubs, again, obsidian blades or stone blades. Very effective when your enemies are using the same stuff, but as we mentioned with the Aztecs, less effective when your enemies have steel, gunpowder, crossbows, things like that. The Inca civilization, like the Aztecs, was polytheistic and included human sacrifice as well to appease the desire of the gods. They built massive cities in the mountains with temples and markets, very similar to the Aztecs. And they developed an early system of recording, not quite writing, but recording, known as quipa, using knotted ropes to tell stories. And of course, this is very difficult to learn, so very few Incans really knew how to write, quote unquote, in this fashion or read these. Very few did, generally just priestly caste. And here's the ruins of one of their great cities, which they literally did build high, high in the mountains, making them very defensible, and elements of Inca ingenuity and innovation with metalworking, gold, silver, turquoise, things like that. The Inca Empire stretched across the Andes Mountains, and they had to learn to adapt to them. So we see in both the Inca and Aztec very intense adaptations to geography. One of the adaptations they made was terracing. Now, I want to be very clear, they did not learn these from the Chinese. They never encountered the Chinese. They developed this on their own, like we saw in India with Indians developing terracing on their own. And they use this to feed their large population because it's very hard to grow crops on the mountains. So it is very labor intensive. You are effectively cutting steps into the sides of solid stone mountains. and they used the tribute labor of the tribes they conquered to dig these. The Incas themselves aren't really too keen on doing a lot of this work, or at least the warrior class was not. Maize was also their main crop. They also had squash and beans as well. And they also have access to the Amazon River to provide, at least in the lowlands, some level of irrigation. And the highlands, they would have tribute laborers bring water up, or they would have to rely on just the moisture of being in the higher altitude and rain. And so here you can see this Amazon River basin stretching across a lot of the lands of the Incas, providing them with water access. Achievements of the Inca include a massive series of roads. I mean, we've seen this. It's very hard to control a large empire, and their empire was literally 12,000 miles of roads covering it, cut across very hard mountainous landscape and paved with large paver stones to be a very effective road system. And then across mountains, they would build rope bridges. And so using this allowed them to control their empire and prevent rebellion, like the Han Dynasty of China, like the Roman Empire. These groups are going to build roads to control their empire, to make it easier for tribute to be collected, to make it easier for tribute laborers to get to the cities and the work jobs that they needed. And they also created a messenger system where runners stationed periodically at houses along this massive road network would transmit messages. So, you'd have a runner run as far as a human can comfortably run in a couple hours, and every such distance there was a little house, a messenger station. His message could be handed over to the next guy, who would then carry it his distance of running, and so on and so on. So, kind of like a Pony Express, but using people instead of ponies. And so this allowed their empire to expand. It allowed their empire to become rich. It allowed their empire to trade internally for goods and food as needed. So what happens to the Incas? Well, yeah, it's the Spanish. It's the Spanish again. So the main conqueror of the Inca Empire was another conquistador, right? Spanish for conqueror, named Francisco Pizarro, pictured here to the right. And he and an army of 168 other conquistadors, seeing the success of Hernan Cortez with the Aztecs, sought to explore the New World and basically find their own pathway to incredible riches, silver, gold, etc. They eventually seized control over the Inca Empire using their technology and weapons, and held him ransom and then killed him. So that then led to a brutal war between the Incas and between the conquistadors. But they're eventually able to win this war and capture the capital, Machu Picchu, high up in the mountains. And then the Spanish in general, as well as Pizarro, spent the next several decades finalizing and formalizing the conquest of Inca territory, which is considered to be kind of finished in 1572. Again, what allowed them their success? Better weapons, guns, steel, horses, gunpowder, and like the Aztecs, the Inca Empire was hammered by disease, by infighting of various groups that were angered by being controlled by the Incas. So there was native help and rebellions across the Inca Empire. So, there a lot of credit should be given to Spanish technology and Spanish innovations and weapons, but we must also understand that disease plays a huge role in killing large numbers of the soldier class in both the Aztec and Inca Empire, as well as kind of making people doubt the legitimacy of the rule of these empires. Because, like, all right, well, these are the gods punishing you with all these diseases, and then rebellions, as people see the weakness of the ruling elite as a chance to rebel. And all of that political instability makes it easier for the Spanish to conquer these very powerful empires. So, what then happens in Central and South America is the creation of a Spanish empire. From 1500 to 1600, a flood of Spanish conquistadors comes across the Atlantic Ocean and invades Central and South America and parts of North America as well. This is part of the encounter, this is part of the Columbian Exchange, and the Spanish are going to import their style of government, their religion, Roman Catholicism, and their ideas to the New World. The colonies that the Spanish set up were controlled by the Spanish king through representatives known as viceroys. And so these guys are generally nobles appointed directly by the king to be his agents and rule provinces and colonies set up in this new empire. And then they were expected to manage labor, to manage the military, and to send wealth back to Spain, typically in the form mostly of silver and gold. And then later on, sugar became an incredible trade good, and tobacco and other goods like that. So religion then becomes a huge element of cultural diffusion, not necessarily always peacefully. So the Spanish conquistadors, right from the beginning, were also accompanied by missionaries, Roman Catholic missionaries, typically of monastic orders like the Jesuits, founded by Ignatius Loyola, and the Franciscans, founded initially by followers of St. Francis of Assisi. And these guys, when getting to the New World, are blown away that like the word of their God, God and the Bible had not reached this massive population in the New World. And so, again, within Christian theology, if you've never been baptized, if you don't follow the tenets of Christianity, you're going to hell. That's Christian theology. And so they want to allow these people in their mind to convert to Christianity and save their souls. That's the Christian mindset here. And so these missionaries start coming over in larger numbers as well, following the conquistadors, working to convert the native population to Catholic Christianity. Especially the Jesuits and Franciscans were often very eager to learn the native language to better convert people. And these missionaries, being educated, knowing how to read and write, also helped govern and manage the colonies as well, because they acted essentially as kind of the scribes of the conquistadors, who not all of them could read and write. Many could, but not all. Unfortunately, while sometimes these conversions were voluntary and they were like, yep, let me tell you about Jesus. He's pretty cool. He's the most powerful God. And, they had some evidence to help them on this. Like the ancient gods of the Inca and Aztec and these Amerindians had not protected them from disease. Neither would the Christian God, but that's neither here nor there. They had not protected them from conquest. And also, the natives realized that they generally were treated better by the Spanish if they were Christian. Not always, but generally they were treated better. These monks and missionaries also worked to destroy native culture. They don't want temples. They would destroy temples, kill priests, and kill non converts as well. So it's a very violent and kind of forced conversion of this massive population. But the effect that the majority of Central and South America today are Roman Catholic. And there is not a lot of native religious practitioners anymore. And you got this great cartoon here. You've got the conquistador and the Franciscan monk. Dios mío, my God, they're sacrificing people, and he's watching the natives sacrifice individuals as part of blood sacrifice. It's horrible. We've got to do something. And then they kill most of the Aztecs and Indians. And later, no more human sacrifices here. Gods be praised. So, blood and blood either way you pick. One of the most horrifying elements of Spanish rule was known as encomienda, and it's definitely a clear human rights violation. But it was the system used by the Spanish to force the natives to work for them, and it is essentially a system of exploitation of labor and slavery. So the idea of encomienda is that every conquistador, every Spanish elite, so again, the conquistadors are the majority of them, but also there were Roman Catholic encomiendas too, where they build a church and the land around it is an encomienda. It's a piece of land given to the Spanish elite by the crown. So it's kind of almost like a feudalism type thing. And the idea of encomienda is any natives that lived on that land had to work for the Spanish without being paid. So again, it's a system of exploitation of labor. It's a system of forced labor. It is brutal. It is very oppressive. And the natives were often just straight up worked to death or very close to it. If you tried to run away, the Spanish would use war dogs, and you can actually see these pictures of these war dogs to hunt people down and rip them apart as kind of a sign, like this is what happens when you run away. And natives would be beaten, natives would be tortured if they did not do this. And so it is a system of slavery and violence and fear. Now, the Spanish first used encomienda to force natives to work in silver mines. One of the most famous of these is Potasi in modern day Bolivia. It turned out that there is some gold in the New World, but there's really tons of silver. There was a ton of silver. Silver mining is brutally dangerous, and because the Spanish themselves aren't going in the mines, they don't care about worker safety or making the mines safer by building wooden supports to hold up the ground. So you had collapses. The air in mines was notoriously unclean, leading to people to die. They were worked with almost no food, constantly breaking hard rock, carrying heavy rock dust and soil to sort through for the silver. The refining of silver usually uses mercury, which is highly poisonous, so natives are dying from that. And it's interesting, while this encomienda system leads to the death of thousands of natives, um, both through the violence of it and the unsafe practices, it also had a negative impact eventually on the Spanish. So initially, this silver coming into the Spanish Empire leads to the Spanish Golden Age, right, under Philip II, where you have this massive renewal of Renaissance ideas. You have them building fleets. You have them engaging in wars and conquering land in Europe and also conquering land in the New World. But eventually, so much silver comes in there, it effectively crashes the Spanish economy because it causes massive inflation. There's so much silver that basically their currency becomes worthless. And so after that, Spain becomes weaker and weaker and weaker. The average lifespan of one of the workers in these mines was less than 6 months. And we have stories from both priests and primary sources that say that mothers of young children would sometimes cripple their children because the Spanish wouldn't take cripples into the mines, so they would like cut off a couple of their kids' fingers or smash their kid's foot, crippling them for life. But then at least they would live, because those who were sent into the mines almost never returned. You died in these mines. As the silver began to dry up, the encomienda system began to be used on plantations. Plantations are anything that's a large estate, large chunk of land focused on growing cash crops. So plantations don't grow food too often. You grow cash crops, which are crops grown for sale in return for a profit. So examples include sugar, tobacco, and coffee. All of these are luxury goods. Like, you don't need sugar to live. You don't need tobacco to live. You don't need coffee to live. But these things were in incredibly high demand in Europe as luxury goods. And so you force the natives to work on these plantations, and then you ship these refined goods, refined sugar, molasses, tobacco, and coffee to the old world, to Europe, and you get a huge profit. Sugar plantations, all of these plantations were dangerous to work, but sugar plantations were notoriously dangerous to work. Sugar breaks down very quickly as you harvest it, and so you have to run these sugar mills, which kind of smash, bash up, use superheated steam to refine the sugar into a usable product. Um, and frequently, workers are caught in this machinery. They're worked to death, worked to heat exhaustion in the fields. And eventually, this system kind of collapses, the system of encomienda, at least. Why? One, there are laws passed by the Spanish crown that kind of eventually free a lot of natives from encomienda labor. But the more important reason is really population loss. So many of the natives working in Comienda die from disease, Spanish violence, Spanish mines, or run away, that they're not really viable workers anymore. There's a labor shortage. And then this then cause and effect leads to African slavery, needing people to still work in these plantations. Europeans, like the Spanish and like the Portuguese and like the English later, increasingly look to African slaves from Africa to work these plantations, which begins the African slave trade across the Atlantic. I'd like to point out the African slave trade already existed in Africa to the Arab nations, Ottoman Empire, and other Islamic kingdoms, but this begins the Atlantic slave trade. There was, of course, resistance to encomienda. The natives did not like this system. They hated it. There were several rebellions. Some of them, had minor successes killing Spanish conquistadors, but eventually all of them were crushed again because of the superior weapons and violence of the Spanish. Some Spanish priests coming to the New World also spoke out against encomienda. These guys are like, hey, I'm here to try and convert the natives, and it's pretty hard to tell them how great Jesus and merciful God are, and kind God and Jesus are, when we're forcing these people into brutal slavery and beating them. However, these same priests often suggested using Africans instead. So I don't want to point out that these guys are not super great either. One of the most famous of these individuals was Bartolome de las Casas. So he comes over to the New World and it witnesses the invasion of conquistadors into what would be eventually Cuba. And he's watching these guys just hack and slash and capture slaves. He's like, wow, this is brutal. So he spends 50 years of his life tirelessly working to abolish encomienda and to abolish the harsh treatment, trying to convince the Spanish king, the crown, to adopt a more humane form of colonization. And he writes a very famous book, A Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies, trying to work to help to win others. He travels back and forth from the New World to the court at Spain to be in conference with the king, being like, we gotta change encomienda. We have to end encomienda. And here is a passage from this book. I saw here in Cuba cruelty on a scale no living being has ever seen or expects to see. And never have the Indians and all the Indies committed any act against Spanish Christians until those Christians have first and many times committed countless cruel aggressions against them or against neighboring nations. With my own eyes, I saw Spaniards cut off the nose and ears of Indians, male and female, without any provocation, merely because it pleased them to do it. Likewise, I saw how they summoned the caciques, priests, and chief rulers to come, assuring and promising them safety, and when they peacefully came, they were taken captive and burned alive. So his book really changes the minds of some people in Spain because, like, wow, this is what's going on. Especially members of the church who were really horrified by their fellow Christians being this violent against these natives. Bartolome de las Casas was eventually successful in improving the legal status of the natives, and later in his life, after first suggesting use Africans instead and seeing African slavery, was like, you know what, let's just get rid of all slavery. He's not successful in that. But he is successful in convincing the king to pass what were called the New Laws of 1542. And the long name of these are the New Laws of the Indies for the Good Treatment and Preservation of the Indians. And what this did is outlawed the encomienda and freed all natives from slavery. However, the kings in Spain and the conquistadors are in Central and South America. So it actually takes nearly 2 centuries for encomienda to die out because the king didn't have very good representation in the colonies. For his actions in fighting for the rights of American Indians, he has been sainted and is considered like a righteous person for working to help protect the natives. As encomienda system dies out, as the native Amerindians either die of disease, being overworked in mines and plantations, or assimilate into Spanish society. One of the other elements of encomienda is if you had any Spanish blood at all, you could not be forced into labor because of encomienda. So many native women chose to have children with Spanish conquistadors because that meant those children could not be forced to work. And so by the mid late 1500s, early 1600s, there literally are not enough Indians or Amerindians to do the labor. And so in the 1500s, Europeans begin to view enslaved Africans as a valuable trade good from Africa. They can replace the Amerindians and fix this labor shortage problem on plantations. And so the slave trade became highly profitable for Europeans. That's why they engaged in it. And so what developed is the famous triangle trade between Europe, Africa, and the New World, which we call the triangle trade. All right, Europeans traveling to Africa and picking up slaves in exchange for trade goods, sending them into the New World, picking up the luxury goods, sugar, stuff like that, sending it back to Great Britain, Spain, and Europe. And again, here's a bigger map of this. I do expect geographically to understand this map, like why are they going to Africa? It's for slaves. What is this all about? It's about imperialism and colonization. So let's take a look at what's getting traded. So from Europe and England, they're shipping iron products, alcohol, glass beads, and textiles. That's what the Africans wanted. Alcohol, specifically hard liquor, the Africans didn't really have a good climate for producing that. And more importantly, they didn't really have the technology to produce hard liquor, specifically rum was a big one. And so that was a very desirable trade good for its inebriating effects, I guess, if you want to call it that. Many of these Africans did not have access to reliable iron weapon creation, iron tool creation. So iron products were a huge hit. And later on, guns. The Europeans would sell older guns to these natives, and then, of course, gunpowder, as well as glass beads, sometimes called slave beads, because, again, the Native Africans didn't have the technology down really in order to make their own glassware. What would they pick up? Mostly slaves, mostly slaves. And they would be transported to the West Indies to work in plantations all throughout here, where they would then ship tobacco, sugar, and goods like that back to Europe. So the triangle trade was utterly based and reliant on the African slave trade. I mean, it just needed it. What this causes is a lot of changes in Africa itself. So before the African slave trade, a lot of the most powerful kingdoms in Africa were like on the interior: Ethiopia, Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. These tribes that had, or kingdoms, I'm sorry, that had access to gold and salt trade, access to other goods like that. But as Europeans started to arrive along the coastline, the western coastline of Africa, and trade, the Europeans did not like going into the interior of Africa. There were tons of diseases like malaria and mosquito-borne diseases that killed white people. The climate wasn't to their liking. They didn't know the land. There weren't really good coastlines to build massive forts that they could project their power very easily. The rivers proved innavigable to European ships. And so they just plopped their ship down, built some slave forts or slave little buildings here, and traded with the coastal kingdoms. So, a huge effect of this African slave trade is power shifts from the interior African kingdoms to coastal kingdoms and tribes. And seeking access to the goods the Europeans brought, the weapons, the iron tools and weapons, the guns, the alcohol, and the infamous slave beads, these glass beads, these coastal tribes began to raid into the interior, capturing slaves. They're attacking other tribes, not necessarily to kill them, but to capture them. They tie them up, they march them to the coastline, and they sell them to the Europeans. And so there's this odd idea that there's white Europeans with a net capturing black Africans. It's not really true very often. The majority of the slave trade was certain powerful tribes and kingdoms on the coast capturing other groups, not just capturing them. Like they reformed their law codes to make the punishment for most crimes slavery, because these princes and these kings of these African kingdoms wanted more guns, wanted more wealth, wanted more power. And so the best way to get that was more guns. The best way to get those was capturing more slaves and selling them to Europeans. The journey to the New World was truly horrific, and a name given to it is the Middle Passage, because it's the middle leg of the journey from this triangle trade. These ships are all about profit, and so you need to pack in as many slaves as possible because every single one of them, has a dollar amount attached to them. And so the best practice, quote unquote, was called tight packing, each slave giving 4 feet of space on a journey that could take weeks or even more than a month. In these brutal conditions, in these overcrowded ships, disease ran rampant. The Africans were frequently not given enough food or water. Sickness was common. They didn't exactly clean these ships out very well, so a lot of these people are chained into their own filth, which can also cause diseases. Some Africans chose suicide by trying to throw themselves off the decks of ships. Some tried to rebel and take control of the ships. Frequently, those were not super successful. There's a couple examples in which they did successfully take a ship, but the Africans typically didn't know how to operate these sailing ships, so that also might not saves them from slavery, but they die of thirst on board these effectively floating prisons now. And this is a very famous underwater memorial of slaves who had chosen suicide by jumping off the ship rather than be enslaved. I mean, a lot of these guys didn't even know, and girls didn't even know what their fate was going to be. I mean, there was a myth in Africa that the whites ate them, because these ships would come, land on the coastline, fill up their holds with slaves, and they would never return. And the Europeans just kept coming back for more and more and more. It's like, what are you doing to these people? Like, maybe they're eating them. And I think I would definitely say that certainly the Africans who were capturing other Africans and selling slavery did not know the true horror that awaited these people. I mean, some might have, but my guess is many didn't. Another result of this triangle trade is known as the African diaspora. So we can compare it to the Jewish diaspora, the forced spreading of people and culture. The slaves who survived the Middle Passage were forced to live and work in dangerous conditions on plantations. Your average life expectancy upon arriving in the New World was 7 years, because they were just worked to death. Slaves in America often died before the age of 25, again, worked literally to death. And colonial slaves could not maintain their own population. The Spanish, the Portuguese, they had no desire, or they didn't care enough to like get the slaves to breed more slaves so they wouldn't have to keep importing them. They're like, nope, slaves are cheap enough, just keep bringing them to the New World. And it's thought that by 1800, over 11 million Africans had been forcibly transported, a forced migration to the New World. However, these Africans their society do bring elements of their religion. Many are also converted to Christianity, which gives rise to like interesting combinations. Voodoo theoretically is a combination of some Christianity combined with native practices, rituals, and religions of the African peoples coming over. But this is highly damaging to Africa as well. They're losing, well, millions of people over the space of centuries. And a lot of times slave owning Europeans, they wanted the strongest, healthiest people. Even the people on the ships, the Europeans coming over the ships, they're going to examine all the slaves they're buying, check their teeth. Do they have good teeth? Do they have good muscle tone? They're only going to take the strongest, most fit, because so many are going to die in the Middle Passage. And so you're exporting like kind of the healthiest, most fit individuals, and this leads to a huge drain on Africa. More men were taken than women. It has all these societal implications. And certainly, obviously, I don't think I need to say this, but slavery is a violation of human rights. It is exploitation of labor. It fits into all that stuff. And just really, really brutal on Africa and the slaves carried over. Another effect of Spanish conquest in the New World were the development of social classes. So there's a very small minority of Spanish rulers, and they've got to come up with a system to like make sure they stay in power. And they viewed the mixing of races as kind of a bad thing. So they developed these things called La Castas, a series of strict social classes for the colonies. These were based on race and blood and deal with classes and inequality. You have this very multiracial or biracial makeup of individuals in this New World empire. You have white Europeans, you have Amerindians, black Africans, and then you have those biracial and mixed race individuals. So the Europeans, the Spanish specifically, and the Portuguese to a lesser extent, they made these strict class systems to enforce white European control. At the top were the Peninsulares. They are born in Spain or Portugal. They travel to the Americas for business opportunities to be in charge, and they're at the top of the social order. They're in control of the colonies, right? This is the viceroy and nobility appointed by the king to control the colonies. And they're at the top. They make all the economic and government decisions. Below them was another powerful class known as the Creoles. So they have quote unquote full Spanish blood, but they're born in the Americas. They're the descendants of the original conquistadors. And they developed into a local aristocracy. They owned land. Many of them today in our economy would be the equivalent of like millionaires or very, very wealthy people. They owned the plantations, they owned the encomiendas, so very, very wealthy. A lot of them served in the military, deeming that as kind of their aristocratic fate. And they were also businessmen, being very, very wealthy. Below them were the mixed raced individuals. These were people that had part Spanish and part either native or African blood. Mestizos is what they were called. If they had part native blood, mulattoes or cuatros were what they were called if they had, or quadroons, sorry, are what they were called if they had part African blood. And if you were an Amerindian, there was a desire to have children with the Spanish because, again, mestizos were exempt from encomienda. And then at the bottom were pure blood, quote unquote, Africans and pure blood natives who were exploited for their labor. There was a small class of freed Africans. Typically, they became soldiers working for the Peninsulares and Creoles to enforce their rule. And so this very strict racially motivated class system, definitely not either. There was an increasing amount of cultural diversity as all these different groups mixed together. Christianity is expanding. And the Spanish created these, and the Portuguese created these La Castas, these race charts to track like blood purity. And really, this could depict where you could live, what jobs you could have, who you could marry. All this was based on birth and so-called blood purity, based on how close you were to pure European blood in the New World. So again, a system of oppression, a system of exploitation of labor. We would consider the strict class system based on birth a violation of human rights today. They didn't. The Spanish are like, no, this is fine. We love this. Thumbs up, double thumbs up even. But again, today we examine this and say, well, this is racially motivated. This is inherently wrong. I would expect you to be able to recognize this class system and maybe compare it to other class systems we've seen that have been based on birth, whether it's European or Japanese feudalism, whether it's the caste system of Hinduism under the Gupta and previous empires. Whatever the class system is, I would like you to make these comparisons, though there are elements of this that are new because it's like one race ruling over other races. So again, Peninsulares, Spanish and Portuguese born in Spain, Creoles, quote unquote pure Spanish blood, but born in the New World, they develop into an aristocracy. Mestizos, born of Spanish and Native American blood. You also would have your mulattoes, mixed African and Spanish blood, Native American Indians, and then enslaved persons at the bottom. Wrapping it up or summing this all up, Spanish of the colonization of the New World devastates Amerindian populations, destroys the Aztec and Inca empires and their cultures. Disease, wars, the forced labor of encomienda, and conversion, sometimes forced, to Catholicism effectively destroys these cultures that have existed for hundreds and thousands of years. Then the need for labor, as encomienda dies out and more natives are converted or of mixed race, the shortage of labor in the colonies leads to the development of the African slave trade, resulting in the African diaspora. This is harmful to Africans and African society, but it brings great wealth to European nations and the European rulers of the new colonies. It creates multiracial, multicultural societies in Americas as an example of cultural diffusion. And here you have the destruction of the Incas. Here is pretty interesting. So this is the family crest of John Hawkins. He was an English European, and he is considered the first person to successfully make a run of the triangle trade, to stop in Europe, to stop in Africa, to stop in the New World, and make it back to Europe, making a profit at each stage of this. And for kind of showing that this could be highly profitable, managing your ships in this manner, he was gifted with a title of nobility by the English crown. And they gave him this crest. And you can see, he's got the British lion, he's got the waves symbolizing naval power and supremacy. And then he also has a slave here because it was the slave trade that made this guy wealthy and powerful. So that's what we have for this colonization. This is what we will lead into next year when we get to Global 10. Like, this is the society of Central and South America, this class system of La Castas, this violence of African slavery, the exploitation on the plantations. This is the scene we will have when we emerge in Global